Last time we stopped with Augustus.
Yes.
His real name is
Octavius.
Octavius. That's right. Okay. In fact, he's actually got the same name as his adopted father, Gaius. Yeah. Well, Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar. Remember, Julius was his surname rather than his family name, his patrician name, and so he was a grandnephew of Julius Caesar, but adopted as his son, and so he's Gaius Octavius. Okay, and he becomes then the princeps, the first citizen of Rome. Okay, and he through a little civil war, he gets rid of Mark Antony, and he's able to, and in fact he's able to do this because of his right hand man. Okay, his right hand man is kind of his main general, a guy called Agrippa. And Agrippa is an excellent strategist. It's also it tells you something about the man, because he's only 19 years old when all of this starts happening. So you can see that he's quite an advanced fellow for that kind of age.
He managed to get a lot of money from Julius Caesar to bribe the legions. And that's how he got control of the army and won the civil war.
It is. Well, we're going to talk about the army just now, because you'll see that I've brought a little show and tell. I thought it was time to kind of not just talk, but actually show you something. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the legions just now. But what I want to do is to finish the story of Rome, is to finish kind of just the AD story, and we're going to do that in very broad strokes, so that we kind of get a sense of how the flow happened within the process. But we've got Augustus. He takes control in roundabout 27 BC. Okay, 27 BC is that when he then becomes the first citizen. Okay, and he continues to reign until
40 years.
for 43 years. That's right. Okay, he's the emperor. Well, he's the emperor in everything but actual title. Okay. Now, one thing that you need to see that this is, it's so important for Rome that at this point they should have an imperator, an emperor that actually reigns for a significant period of time. I mean, you can imagine. I mean, with Julius Caesar, remember Julius Caesar was assassinated by the Senate because they felt that he was going to undermine their power. Okay, so you can imagine that you're at the crossroads of a new system. If in fact all they had were lousy leaders after that and short-termers, what would have happened potentially is that Rome would have just collapsed. It would have broken up into little provinces, each doing their own thing under their own little petty king. But just at this time comes Augustus. He was exactly the right guy at exactly the right time.
Have you turned that back on?
I have. Okay, but exactly the right guy at exactly the right time. But not only for the Romans. He was exactly the right guy at the right time for Christianity. Why? Because he establishes the stability of Rome. Okay? And it's in the midst of that stability that, as you can see, he straddles the beginning of Christ, or the time of Christ. Okay? So that when Jesus comes along, he comes into an environment which, as I said last time, was called the
Pax Romana.
Pax Romana. Now, let's not get too Disney about the Pax Romana. The Pax Romana, Pax means peace, and so it's the Roman peace. But notice that the Roman peace was not a peace on the borders, it was a peace inside Rome. Okay? So what that meant was that this was a period of about 200 years where there were no civil wars. Okay? So everybody was, by and large, happy under Roman rule. Now, you can understand that when you're trying to establish a new religion, that when you're trying to establish something new in the environment, the one thing that helps to promote that is peace. And you can see that what Augustus brings about is that peace. So there's no civil wars inside the Roman Empire, which means that trade can flourish. Because again, remember that one of the things that falls down when there's war is that trade can't happen. Okay, because people are too afraid to move things around. So what happens is that when there's no trade, there's no movement of people. But if you read the Bible, if you read the time of Paul, for example, he's constantly going on missionary journeys. Now those missionary journeys would not have been possible if there were civil wars happening all over the place.
But if there were civil wars, wouldn't they just then start, like diaspora Jews, start radiating out from where the troubles are, and then that starts up?
That happens later. Yes, that happens later. But you remember, you need to get your foothold. You need to get a foothold first.
Right.
And it's that foothold that the peace enables. So by the time the civil wars begin to erupt, which is later on in the late part of the 1st century, or actually the early part of the 2nd century, what you begin to do is that the footholds are already established. Okay? So in many ways, Augustus is very much the guy at the right time, at the right place, with the right credentials to actually make this happen.
Where in the New Testament there's an assertion that at the right time God sent his son. What's the reference? Can you remember?
No. I think the word is appropriate time rather than right time. But I think that's the concept of it. And you need to see that Christianity happens at exactly the right moment in history. Okay, that Christ comes at exactly a pivotal moment within history. You can see that just a little bit outside of this context, and Christianity would not have had the influence that it did as quickly as it did. Okay? Because remember that by 70 AD, the temple's destroyed. So already by 70 AD, if Christ had come after 70 AD, his whole message would have been a different kind of message. Because his message was directed towards the temple. And the fact that he was the replacement, he was the new concept of what the temple would be. Of course, in 70 AD as well, many of the Jews had already been scattered. So you don't have that collection of Jews to actually hear the message, be converted by the message, and then become the disciples that will actually go out and share that message. So you can see that the time frame within which the coming of Christ comes is absolutely pivotal. Okay? Plus you can remember that Augustus was very much into Greek philosophy. And so he promoted the process of actually using Greek as a second language for Rome and as a primary language for the Eastern Roman Empire. Now remember that the New Testament gets written in Greek. So straight away, because of that, it's able to spread like wildfire, because everybody can speak Greek. They can understand it. Now they might have the argument in their own language, but the writing of Paul or the writing of the Gospels are in a language which they can understand. Okay. Plus, of course, the Romans are building roads throughout the whole of Europe. Remember, there's that old English saying, all roads lead to Rome. And that's exactly what they did. All roads did lead to Rome. Okay, because of course all the taxes and the trade came back to Rome. But not only that, so did the missionaries. They were able to go on those roads from all the outer areas of the Roman Empire to Rome. So do you see how the timing of Augustus is both pivotal for the Romans, but it's also pivotal for Christianity. That he's kind of the man at the time that he needs to be there. Does it make sense? Okay, and so he's there until 17 AD. Now, at this point, things don't really do well for the Roman Empire because you get a succession of fairly poor emperors. Okay, and these are called the Julio-Claudian emperors. Okay, the Julio-Claudian emperors, and that begins with who's the emperor after Augustus?
Caligula.
Sorry,
Caligula.
no, not Caligula, not yet,
Claudius.
not yet,
Vespasian.
not yet. Come on, you should know. It's in the Bible.
Tiberius?
Tiberius.
I was just going to say that.
She says that all the time.
I'm glad you were going to say that, Tony. It's excellent that you were going to say that. Yes, Tiberius. So Tiberius takes over, and he becomes the next emperor. And of course, he's the one that we read about as well in the Bible. Okay, so the Bible talks about Tiberius, and that was in the time when Jesus then began his ministry. Okay, so when he begins his ministry, Tiberius is the emperor. After Tiberius comes Caligula. Okay, and of course Caligula is his nickname, not his real name, but because Caligula means little boots.
Little bit.
Yeah, because he used to dress up as a Roman soldier when he was a child and was taken to the legions, and so he had these little boots on, and so they called him Bootsy or Caligula. I think it also messed him up a little bit because he was a bit mad, and so after him comes
Nero.
no
Not yet.
Claudius, and then Nero. And of course, Nero is one that we get to connect with as well, because we believe that Nero was the guy who killed Paul. In fact, Peter and Paul. Okay, Peter and Paul were both killed during the reign of Nero. Okay, and then of course we have a year where we have three different emperors, and then the next guy who takes over is the guy who's just been putting out the first big civil war, and that civil war has happened in 65 AD, and it happens in Israel, in Judea. It's the rising up of the Jews against the Romans. And this guy goes there as the head of the army, the legate for the army, and his name is Vespasian. Okay? And Vespasian goes there and he ruthlessly subdues the revolt in the northern part in Galilee, and he puts down the revolt there. There's actually an interesting story again, and it's one which happens at least another one time that I know of, where a group of rebels are held up in a cave. The Romans have surrounded them, are about to breach their defenses, and the men inside say, well, we're not prepared to be slaves, so what we'll do is we won't commit suicide, because you can't do that.
You killed the next person.
That's it. So what we'll do is we'll draw names out of a pottery jar, and that becomes the guy that you kill. And so that way there's not committing suicide, but rather killing each other, until of course there's only one guy left, and then he's in trouble. And so what happens to him? He becomes the historian called Josephus.
Oh, my goodness.
So Josephus, who I told you about last week, is Joseph ben Matthias, actually becomes the Roman historian Josephus. Okay, so he's saved by Vespasian, and he actually becomes then part of the Roman court. and follows them around as they then do the rest of the rebels. But just as Vespasian now he's taken his legions and he's going to defeat Jerusalem, which is where the hotbed of the other rebels are, he's recalled to Rome to become the next emperor. Okay, and so Vespasian becomes the emperor, and he then gives the mantle of leadership onto his son, a guy called Titus. Okay, and Titus then controls the legions that go into Jerusalem, and they break down the city walls, they destroy the temple, they enslave the people who are there. In fact, they don't enslave them; they actually kill all the people in Rome, and in Jerusalem. The number of people who are killed in Jerusalem over and over would make you really not want to live there, because it happens repeatedly through history where everybody in Jerusalem is killed. But he kills the people in Jerusalem. They pillage, they rape, they do their things there, and a number of the Jews escape. And end up in the fortress, the Herodian fortress called Masada.
Still famous.
It's still famous, absolutely, and in fact still in use as well. The Israeli army use Masada for their what they call clearing out ceremony, where they actually receive their rank and so on after they finish training. They do their kind of oath of service on Masada. Again, it was a group of Jews who said, no, we won't be slaves. I think his name was Eleazar, was the leader of that group. And again, the men kill their wives and children and then kill each other. And so when the Romans finally when Titus actually breaches the walls of this fortress, well, there's a few left who are still alive, but almost everybody is dead. And so that concept of we will not give up, we will not become slaves, it becomes almost ingrained within the Jewish psyche. It becomes part of the Jewish DNA. And I think it's still part of it's very much part of the DNA in Israel today. It's that what we call the Zionist DNA of saying we will survive, we will keep going. And so that's in 70 AD. And so effectively they get rid of that particular civil war, and then they continue in the process. The civil war continues again in a couple of more times until 135 AD. And in 135 AD, the civil war is again ruthlessly put down, and this time the Romans say, enough. Enough is enough. We're no longer even going to acknowledge this as a country. We're no longer going to call it Judea. We're now going to call it a new name. Palestine. Palestina. And we're going to rename Jerusalem. It's no longer be called Jerusalem, it'll be called Aeola Capitolina. Okay, so you can look at that in fact the Romans wanted to eradicate the Jewish concept or the Jews themselves from history. Okay, and that's an important thing to understand, because at that point Israel becomes devoid basically of Jews. Only Jews that are left run. They run into the Parthian Empire in the east. They run into Egypt and North Africa. They run into the other parts of the Roman Empire where they become essentially refugees. Okay? And they set up little communities, or they go to the Jewish communities that are already in those areas, some of which have been there for hundreds of years, especially in Asia Minor. Okay? But essentially they run. In fact, they run so far as places like Spain, where a major Jewish population ends up in Spain. They run north into Russia. Okay, so into Eastern Europe. And so many of those Eastern Europe Jewish communities start in this period. Okay? But essentially the Holy Land is devoid of Jews.
It's amazing, because that is preparation for Paul. All his churches are planted in amongst those communities.
Absolutely. And that's why Paul, again, is another one of those people who happens to be in the right place at the right time. Because if the church was left up to Peter, we would not exist. We wouldn't be here. Okay? Because Peter had a big problem with Gentiles becoming Christians. He had a big problem with it. Okay? In the beginning, he absolutely had a big problem with it because he's a real issue in terms of the first church council, which happens in Jerusalem. And that first church council, which we read about in the book of Acts, was all about should Gentiles be allowed to become Christians. And then, of course, what we see is that later on, he reverts back to his old Jewish ways. And he has a major fallout with Paul. Okay, about the issue of the Gentiles. Now, the thing with it is that what Paul does is he says, no, this message is not a message only for Jews. This is a message that has to be for everybody. And so he goes out and he establishes all these churches all throughout the Roman world. And it's those churches that in the end survive when Israel is destroyed. Because the headquarters of Christianity was in Jerusalem. Okay? But just like you said earlier, that when you sometimes have one of those civil wars, often it spreads out the reality. That's what happened. Is that Christianity then spread to the other centers. And so you end up with a Christian center in Alexandria in Egypt, one in Antioch in Syria, one in Constantinople on the other side of the Bosphorus, and in Rome. And so instead of having one very, very fragile center, Christianity spreads throughout the Roman world. And so that foothold is there. So by the time Israel is destroyed, or Judea is destroyed, they already have Christians now set up in those other Roman centers. And so Christianity can continue even without the headquarters in Jerusalem.
Didn't Peter change his mind though when Cornelius came along?
Well, in fact, it was after Cornelius that he changed his mind back again.
Really?
Yeah.
Where does it indicate that?
It's in Paul's letters.
Right.
Yeah. And so that's...
I thought that was...
Yeah, no. Well, one would think that he had changed his mind and then that would stay that way. But you know for yourself is that we can change our minds. And in some ways, I think what Paul was really saying about Peter wasn't that he changed his mind, but that it depended on who he was with at the time. If he was with Jews, then he kind of was, kind of with them. And then when he was with Gentiles, he kind of was with them again. And so Paul was kind of saying, stay, take one line and stay there.
He would have been a good politician.
Yes, I know. In fact, Dorothy said the same thing. But
So why was Peter then the rock? If it didn't really. It sounds like it was.
Yeah, it's more important.
look, we're going down a rabbit hole now with that. When we ask ourselves, what does it mean for Peter to be the rock? I don't think that it means quite what we think, because there really is only one rock that we build on, and that's on Christ. So to say that Peter's the rock is tricky. I think that what it's talking about is his name. Okay, because of course his name wasn't Peter, his name was
Petros.
Simon.
Okay, or Simeon. His fact would have been Simeon, and that was his actual name. But he gets nicknamed Petros in Greek, or Kephas in Hebrew, both of meaning rock. And I think what that was that he was to be the titular leader of the band in Jerusalem. But to somehow say that we're actually going to build on that rock, I think is using a double entendre. It's using a double meaning in terms of that concept of rock. I don't think that Peter was meant to be the rock on which we build the church, but rather that Peter was meant to be the leader of that early church within Jerusalem. And that goes with the whole Bible, which is often where God has used people who are less than perfect to still continue his plan.
Yes, as well.
And Peter was absolutely less. Oh, well, thank God for that. Absolutely. Because well, that's it. I mean, if you only waited for perfect people, then we'd be all in big trouble. There isn't about perfect people, but there is about perfect timing. And that's certainly what we see in terms of the history of Christianity and Rome. There was a certain sense of perfect timing. The people were often fairly imperfect in many ways. Augustus was too, in lots of different ways. But that was part of that concept. Okay, so we've got Palestina, we've got destruction of that, we've got the church growing in the area. At this point, we can see that Rome continues to do its thing, even under the poor leadership. Okay, and part of the thing with that poor leadership is that the leadership now actually devolves away from the emperor and more to the soldiers, and particularly a group of soldiers who were meant to be the bodyguards of the emperors, who actually become, in a sense, the kingmakers. They're called the Praetorian Guard. Okay, they were actually established by Augustus, but in the end, they actually begin to be a force in and of themselves. In fact, at one point, the head of the Praetorian Guard actually believed that he could become the emperor himself. Of course, then they killed him off, and that was it. You had to be very careful about who stabbed you in the back in terms of the Roman Empire. It was quite a tricky thing. Okay, but what we get then is that after these guys, after the Vespasian and Titus, they were a different dynasty, so not the Julio-Claudians. These guys were called the Flavians, okay, the Flavian dynasty. So after them comes then a period where then we go to kind of where you end up with some of the great names of the Roman era. People like Marcus Aurelius, people like Hadrian, who built Hadrian's Wall, and those guys who then they kind of further the borders. So we get to the full extent of the Roman Empire, which goes from south of Scotland. I always find that so funny, don't you? That they stopped before they got to Scotland.
I understand why.
No.
I think it tells you something about Scottish people so much, that even the Romans said, "No, look, let's just build a wall. Let's not even try and take over those guys. Let's just build a wall and stop here." No, look, part of it that is geography. Okay, because of course you've got very mountainous regions in the northern part of the British Isles, and so of course at the end of the plains is where they build the wall. Okay, remember Romans fought best on plains. Okay, we'll talk a little bit about fighting later on today, but that was where they fought. So they built the wall, and we've got Hadrian's Wall. It's amazing how people have been building walls like forever, isn't it? And 2100, 2119, and we're still wanting to build a wall around it.
Wants to be remembered for.
Well, look, Hadrian is still remembered for it. I mean, so in 100 years' time, well, no, maybe in 500 years' time, when they see the remains of the Mexican wall, they go, "Oh, this is the Trump wall," Maybe that's what he wants. He wants a legacy that will keep going in archaeology for years. Who knows? But the thing with it is that you've got the northern extent being south of Scotland, the southern extent being North Africa, the western extent being Iberia, the Spanish Peninsula, and the eastern extent is halfway through, so into what today we would call Iraq.
What about Northern Europe? How far is it?
Northern Europe, they got to Frankfurt. So we're talking about kind of fairly well into the middle of Prussia is where the boundary line would have been.
What stopped them there going any further?
I think trees.
Because they crossed the Rhine.
They did? Oh yes, they did. I know they got quite far over the Rhine, but that was it. Because I think then it was heavily forested. And I think that again the Romans don't fight well in forests, because they don't fight as individuals.
No,
They fight as a group. And so when you actually fight as a group, whereas of course the barbarians they were fighting against, were used to fighting in those areas, fight as individuals. Okay? And so I think that was the thing, is that what they did was they found a defensive perimeter, and what did they do?
Defended.
They built a wall. That's exactly what they did. They built a wall with forts along that wall in the Germanic to protect themselves from the Germanic peoples as well. So you can see that Rome became Fortress Rome. okay, or the fortress Roman Empire. You had these walls and forts and so on, particularly built by Hadrian, around the various parts of the empire that protected them from the depredations of the tribal groups that they would come against them. Okay, and so after that, so this is around about now 180. So from 180 to about 300 is where things begin to go a little pear-shaped. Okay, where things aren't so good, and they're getting into kings which aren't so good. They're getting into kings which are more bureaucrats, which are also they're killed, assassinated regularly, and replaced by somebody else. And then one of them even got made the emperor because he was a strong physical person. That was his only attribute. He looked like, you know, somebody that you wouldn't mess with. So yeah, let's make him emperor. One guy actually bought the emperorship. He was rich, and so he just paid for it, and he became the emperor. And so you can imagine that in that kind of situation, things begin to go a little pear-shaped until we get to an emperor called Diocletian. And Diocletian, this is now in the late 3rd century, is where he then begins some reforms and tries to organize the process again and try and pull things together in terms of the empire. But it's in the beginning of the 4th century that again something hits that particularly affects us in terms of Christianity. And that's another civil war. As you can imagine, these things happen, where the emperor dies and there's 2 claimants for the throne. And the one claimant who then wins that is a guy called Constantine. Okay? Constantine.
He was the Christian.
Well, it depends on who you ask. It depends on who you ask. He was only baptized on his deathbed. So for me, that sounds a little bit like hedging your bets.
He wasn't very nice.
He wasn't very nice. Well, I don't know. Look, in this period of history, I'm not sure. There were lots of very nice people. So in some ways, he was just connected to his time. But what happened with him, of course, is that, as I said, there was a civil war about who was going to become the next emperor. He was up against the other claimant to that particular throne, and he was actually, they had the smaller army, and that's a big deal. If you've got a smaller army, there's a very good chance you're going to lose. But that night he has a dream, and in his dream he sees the cross, and he hears a voice which says, "Fight under this sign, and I will give you victory." It's called the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. Now, I've actually seen the Milvian Bridge. Yes, when I was in Italy last year, I decided to go and find the Milvian Bridge, and I went and found it. And I invited my boys to come with me, and I explained to them, this was the bridge where the battle fought, where Constantine came in and became the emperor. And they went, "I think we'll stay in the hotel." So not much interest in that. It's in the northern part of Rome. Very easy to get to. I was able to find it just on public transport. Got off, and it is completely and utterly unassuming.
Of course it is.
It's just a bridge. And the truth of it is, of course, now is that the bridge is significantly higher than it was when Constantine took over. Okay, because of course, remember, Rome has been built on top of itself all the time. So in fact, Rome as a city is now higher than it was when that was the area. Because in fact now the river is quite far down from the bridge. But it was at that bridge where the battle takes place. And of course he then paints the cross on the shields of his soldiers, and they then fight under that sign. And even though they are the smaller army, they win. And he becomes the emperor. Okay, he becomes the emperor. And at this point, we really are talking about an emperor now. Okay, really every decision that gets made for the empire goes through him. Okay, and one of the things that happens, of course, is he then decides that all religions now are equal. All religions are equal. Okay, Constantine doesn't actually make Christianity the religion of Rome. That's done by one of his successors, a guy called Theodosius.
Oh, he's the one that said that, is he?
Okay, but he starts the process. Okay, by virtue of becoming a Christian or acknowledging Christ. Now, some people say that he actually wasn't a Christian. Some people believe that he actually was an Arian. No, not Arian with a Y, Arian with an A. Okay, or with an I. Arian is from a guy called Arius, which was a heresy or a heretic. Okay, Arius believed that Christ wasn't the Son of God, but rather that he was a man who was...
Witnesses today.
Yes, like the Jehovah's Witnesses would do. Yeah. Okay, that he was a man who was adopted by God. Okay, so that was Arius's perspective. Okay, and some people feel that Constantine was actually an Arian rather than a Christian. As I said, there's lots of debate about Constantine. As I said, he was only baptized on his deathbed. So, as I said, he may have been just, checking out and making sure that he was covering all his bases before he died. That might be the issue. But what you need to realize is that when he made Christianity equal to the Roman gods, at that point Christianity could come out of the shadows, come out from underground, and literally underground,
Yes.
and begin to build their own churches. Okay, so they could now live in parallel with the gods of Rome. Okay. Now, of course, when Theodosius takes over and makes Christianity the Roman religion, well, then things change, because then those old temples are destroyed. Okay, and they're replaced with churches. And so a lot of those old church basilicas and things are actually sitting on top of old temple sites. Okay, and a lot of the old temples were converted into Christian churches. Okay, so that's part of what happens after Constantine. And that happens not only in Rome, but throughout the Roman Empire.
So what year was that for?
That would have been the late 300s. So about 375.
So the fact that he won that war using the cross to fight under wasn't enough to convince him.
No. It convinced him that Christianity had some value, but it didn't completely convince him that Christianity should be the religion of Rome.
No.
Just thought it was another god.
Well, that in fact was a powerful God, because he was able to help them.
So did he ever try winning other battles using that?
I think it became part of the standard. I think that became part of the standard of Rome, yeah.
So they look upon it perhaps as the god of war.
Exactly. Well, and that for me is it's where Christianity goes wrong. Because Christianity then becomes about war. It becomes co-opted by the state to perpetrate its wars. And of course we've been doing that ever since. So from the 4th century to today, we still co-opt religion into our wars. We co-opt God into our wars. And that was from Constantine. Because Jesus is seen then not as the Savior, as the Lamb who goes to the slaughter, but he's now seen as the hero on a white charger, going in and defeating the enemy. Okay? And so what we have is Constantine then also says that, look, he follows actually Diocletian, because he had already divided up the empire a little bit. So he divides the empire into two sections. You've got the Western Roman Empire with its headquarters in Rome, and the Eastern Roman Empire with its headquarters in, well, Constantinople, because of course it's named after him. Prior to Constantinople, it was called? No, that's now. Byzantium. It was a fishing village. Okay, it originally was a fishing village on the shores of the Bosphorus. Okay, and essentially it was a very important port because it was the link between Europe and Asia. Okay, everything that went from Asia had to cross over, and this was the narrowest part to cross over. So you can imagine that it was a thoroughfare between east and west. So, but it was just a fishing village, and then he makes it into this capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. And so where the Western Roman Empire, the prevailing language is Latin, the Eastern Roman Empire, the prevailing language is Greek. Is Greek. Okay? And so there's the dividing line between the two. Okay? And the big thing that you need to see about this is that it was done for bureaucratic purposes more than anything else. Because of trying to be a bureaucratic perspective for an empire that big, it took a lot of effort to actually make that happen. Okay? And so Constantine decides, let's divide it between the two, and that way we're able to skin this particular cat. Okay? Now, by this stage, when we get to the late 4th century, early 5th century, things begin to have problems for the Romans. They've pulled out of England. They're having problems in Gaul because of some of the tribal groups that are happening. They're actually also now having problems with the other side on the Germanic borders, where in fact, as I've told you before, what's the biggest reason for conquest?
Resources.
Yes, but caused by
High
population growth. Okay, so these small tribal groups, which were on the other side of the Roman Empire, have now begun to get bigger, and they're getting bigger, and they're getting bigger, and they're starting to push against the borders. Now the Romans, of course, are in a situation where they can't find enough people to become soldiers. So what do?
Pull in your borders. Pull in your borders.
Pull in your borders. Okay, so that's one way. Yeah, so you can actually withdraw, but you can only withdraw so far before you start having problems with that.
You get the ones you conquered to be soldiers.
That's what you do. And what you do is you make them citizens. Okay, so there's actually an emperor who decides, don't worry about the whole citizenship thing, because remember, many people couldn't become citizens.
Yeah.
Okay, it was held very closely to become a citizen. It was valued very much. But what he does is he says, no. If you're in the borders, you are a citizen. This was an emperor called Caracalla. Okay, and so he's able to do that. But you can imagine now people don't value being a citizen anymore, because if everybody can do it, then there's no big deal. Okay, but so some of those people now who've come in actually become soldiers. And so instead of having citizens, people who actually value Rome being in the army, you now have people who don't value Rome. They only value their salary. They only value the money that they make. They essentially become mercenaries. Okay? But now what happens? Rome is spending money on lavish stuff, on debauchery, on everything else. There's no money to pay your soldiers. And what do your soldiers then do? They take it. And that's what happens. And so in 410, that's exactly what happens. Is that Rome itself gets sacked. And it's sacked by a guy called Alaric.
Oh, yeah.
And Alaric was from a group called the Visigoths. The Visigoths. Okay? And so Alaric actually leads his army, which in fact is an auxiliary army of Rome, who haven't been paid, and so they come and they take the money that's owed to them. Okay? And they sack Rome. And that's in 410. It had a huge psychological effect on Rome. Okay? Because you'd imagine that Rome thought that they were the pinnacle of the world. And all of a sudden, they get sacked. These people come in and they steal all their valuables. Okay, they pillage, they break down, they destroy, and so on. And that's a major psychological thing. And we know it's a major psychological thing because of one of the theologians that was writing not from Rome, but in fact from North Africa, a guy called Augustine. Okay, Augustine. And he wrote about this particular attack in 410. Okay, and he wrote about it in a book. His magnum opus, which is called. Have you heard of it?
I have, but I don't name it. City of God.
The City of God. Okay, and it's in there that he compares Rome to the celestial city. Okay, to the city in heaven, and he's comparing the difference between them after the barbarians have sacked them. Okay, remember that they called them barbarians. Where did they get that from? Why do we call them barbarians?
The Barbary Coast, something to do
No,
with
because that's on the other side. So it's,
yes.
the barbarians come, in fact, from the way in which Romans were mocking their language. You know, when they speak, it's all ba 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 ba.
That's right.
And so those are the people who speak ba 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 are called. Okay, I like that. I like those little stories. But the thing with it is the barbarians came and sacked them in 410, and things just continued to decline, and they began to lose bits of their empire. Okay, bits of their empire began to be consumed by local leaders, and it's those local things that meant that in the end you ended up just with the little piece of Italy that was still there. Okay, and all of that changes in 476 when the barbarians come and they don't just sack Rome, but they destroy Rome. Okay, and they're destroying Rome not just to get the valuables and take them back home like they did in 410, but now they come to sack Rome to actually stay there. And so they don't actually go and leave, they come and they stay. Okay, and they establish their own villages, their own connections there, and begin to mingle with the Romans who are there. And that happens throughout the whole of the Western Roman Empire. Because it's not just the Visigoths. There's the other barbarian tribes that do it as well. So we get the Ostrogoths. That's always a nice name, isn't it? The Ostrogoths, which go to Spain. You've got the Franks, which obviously end up in Gaul. You've got the Lombards, the Burgundians. Okay? And then the one that I like the most, because we still use it today, the Vandals. Okay? So today, somebody who kind of messes something up, we call them a Vandal, without ever realizing that in fact that was the name of one of these Germanic tribes that actually overruns Europe. Okay? And of course it's those tribes that then re-establish what we today would call modern Europe. Okay? Because they intermarry, interbreed and connect with the Romans or the people who are in those areas, and we get the peoples that we know today, like the Spanish and the French and the Italians and so on. Okay?
And during the period from Constantine and where Christianity could come out from the shadows, and at the time when it was made the religion of the empire, to what extent did it then move into Europe, Northern Europe and the other areas?
Hugely.
And was that because of the Roman policy to do that, or was it happening before then?
No, it was the church's policy. So what happened is that I think the church read the signs of the times much better than the Roman establishment did. Because I think that the church looked at what was happening in the Roman Empire in the late 4th century and realized that the barbarians were coming. And so what did the church do? Yes, that would be the one thing to do. You could run. They converted them.
Yes,
That's exactly what they did. So what the church did was they sent missionaries into all these tribal groups.
And this is from the Roman Church.
The Roman Church, yes, that's right. Yep.
Right.
So it's the church that was centered in Rome, because by this stage the Pope is established. Okay, there's
When did that first go?
the papacy begins really in the late 2nd century is where it becomes an official concept. So it's been around for a while. The Pope is established by the bishops that are in each of the areas of the area. We know that the bishops, for example, in the Christian church is set up very early on.
At that time with Constantine, did that happen at the same time, or was it?
No, long before them. Long before Constantine. So the church was having bishops and so on, but they were underground. They were a secret organization.
So underground popes.
Yes, there were underground popes. I mean, if you look at the list of popes, you'll see it goes all the way back to Peter.
Oh, right.
Okay, so the papacy can look how much you want to believe it. You can, but the papacy traces the lineage of the popes all the way back to Peter himself. Okay.
That explains why Peter had a wife in Judea, but the Pope doesn't have one.
Yeah, no, but you see, that only happens in the 7th century. So in the 7th century, the Pope decided that, in fact, no priests can be married. Prior to that, it was fine to be married.
Now they're paying for it.
Well, yeah, I think we've paid for it for longer than that. But yeah, it's not going to change. It's not going to change. Not easily anyway. Now, so the thing with it is that what you see is that the church was thinking ahead. They converted these barbarians, and so when the barbarians actually sacked Rome in 410 and then finally destroyed Rome in 476, they didn't destroy
They didn't kill
the churches.
Or destroy the churches.
They didn't destroy the churches. And in fact, the churches became safe havens during these periods because often people ran into the church and the barbarians actually left them alone because they actually acknowledged some of the things of Christ. Okay? And so what you find is that once the barbarians have taken over Western Europe, the only organization that spans the whole of Europe is the church. Which is an interesting thing, is why the church continues to grow and to get stronger even after the barbarian invasions. Okay? And it's the church that then keeps the flame of Christianity alive, particularly in things like monasteries.
So what were they teaching them to convince the barbarians to convert? Because it certainly was against their, Christianity as it was meant to be. Because this is Constantine's Christianity.
Yep.
Warlike.
Well, it was very imperial. It was a very
God on your side.
Oh, but you see, I think that in fact they had the exact right hook, because it was all about the God of power. It was all about the Old Testament God. You would go there and smite his enemies and make water separate, and I mean that you can imagine for a warlike people who've just destroyed the Roman Empire. Those stories would. Their Sunday school was all about warfare. Because that's what they would have absolutely connected for them. And remember that the barbarians didn't come without their own gods. They had some of that as well, which is where we then get the syncretism that begins to happen between Christianity, as we had already with the Romans. We have syncretism between Christianity and the barbarians. Things like Christmas trees. Okay, there's no doubt that was originally a pagan concept. Okay, but it begins to be reinterpreted. It's reinterpreted as a Christian one. Okay, the whole concept of having Christmas Day on the 25th of December is a connection with the pagan festivals. Okay, and so we're seeing the pagan festivals coming into Christianity, but reinterpreted in a Christian way. Okay, the funny thing for us at the moment is we get all upset about Christmas and Easter now all being about chocolate and big guys in a big red suit and stuff like that. But I think it's quite funny because all that's happening is that paganism is claiming back what we stole from him in the first place. So Christianity took Christmas and Easter from the pagans, and the pagans are now taking it back again. It's just maybe the way in which the circle turns. I'm not sure. But what you need to understand about the Roman Empire, though, is so the Roman Empire in the West collapses. Okay? But the Roman Empire in the East continues. And now to differentiate itself, it now becomes known as Byzantines. Okay? The Byzantine Empire. Byzantium. Okay? Now, Byzantium is interesting because we need to see that the Eastern Roman Empire is very, very important in terms of the cultural significance of Christianity. And one of the reasons for that is one of the emperors of the Eastern Roman Empire, a guy by the name of Justinian. Okay? Justinian becomes, in a sense, the hero of Eastern Christianity. He builds a major mausoleum. Well, it's not a mausoleum. A major basilica for Christianity, which is called the
Basilica.
What's it called? Hagia Sophia. Okay, Hagia Sophia. Okay, the holy.
Santa Sophia.
So what does Sophia mean?
Goddess. The Virgin Mary.
No, her name is Maria. What is Sophia?
Mother of Constantine.
No, that was Olivia.
Oh, was it? I'm sorry.
That was his wife.
Hagia Sophia. It's not Santa Sophia because Santa is Latin, and remember this is a Greek church, not a Latin church. So Hagia, meaning holy. Sophia meaning
Saviour. Wisdom. Yeah, I knew you told us.
holy wisdom. Okay, it was dedicated to his wife, which I think is quite something. I think that's, if you're going to build something for your wife, it's not too shabby to build something called.
Didn't he kill her in the end?
No. No. You. no. The one. You're thinking of some others that do that kind of killing. There's a fair amount of parental killing happening in the Roman Empire.
Was the off-cycle?
No, unfortunately not. Just leave it for me.
Thanks.
Okay. So, holy wisdom, Hagia Sophia, massive. I mean, it is enormous, and it's it's on my bucket list. I need to tick that one off, is to go and see it. You've been there? Oh, Patsy. The envy continues, man. Absolutely. No, but absolutely, it's great to go and see Hagia Sophia. But what Justinian does is Justinian's mother. In fact, his mother-in-law, I think, she begins to have visions. And the visions that she have are of the Holy Land. Now remember that by this stage, so this is in the 5th century now, the Holy Land is essentially barren. I mean, Jerusalem is a ruin. Very few people living in that area. It's just carrying, the sheep herders and so on that are actually in the Holy Land. But the Byzantine Empire still has control over that area. And so Justinian's mother-in-law begins to have visions of the Holy Land. And she begins to feel that God is calling her to go there.
Yes.
And so she does. And she goes on pilgrimage.
Yes.
Now, pilgrimage is a very big part of religious activity, particularly within this period, but actually been part of activity forever in terms of religious connections, where we go to some place which is seen to be imbued with a special spiritual power. And there's a sense in which that's what happens with Justinian as well and his mother-in-law. And so they do a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. And of course, everywhere they go, his mother has visions and goes, oh, this is where the baptism took place. And they then stick a stake in the ground saying, the baptism of Jesus. And then they go to another place in Jerusalem and stick stake in, this is where the upper room was, and so on and so on. And of course, everywhere where a stake is stuck in.
Great tourist.
Yes. Well, before we get to the tourists, we'll talk about the tourists soon, is that they build a church. They build a church. Remember that the Byzantine Empire is still controlling that area, so therefore they can do this. And they begin to establish something that is now carried on going for the next 1500 years, and that's tourism.
Yes.
Okay, spiritual tourism. Okay, and so she's the one who identified where Jesus was crucified and buried. Okay, and stuck a stake in it, and they built a church on it, and today it's called the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. That's right, Church of the Sepulchre. And she did the same thing in Bethlehem and stuck it in, and that became the Church of the Nativity. And she did another one in Nazareth, and that became the Church of the Annunciation, and so on and so on. And so what you ended up with was all these places which the pilgrims could go and visit. Okay, and that happens through Justinian and his mother-in-law. Okay.
Is pilgrimage viewed so important?
Because it's a physical act. Okay, it's something where you travel, where you journey to actually meet with the presence of God. And you look at the Bible uses that image of journey all the time. You've got the Israelites who journey from Canaan to Egypt. Then you've got the journey out of Egypt into the wilderness. Then the journey for 40 years around the wilderness before they go into the promised land. You've got the journey from Judah to Babylon, and then the exiles returning from Babylon. The concept of journey is absolutely ingrained within the biblical perspective. And so there was absolutely a sense in which that was part of religious discipline, was to actually go on a spiritual journey. Yeah, and so that journey it's absolutely part of Christianity. In fact, so much so that they even made a poor man's pilgrimage. Okay, because remember that to go from Europe to the Holy Land, you had to be pretty well off to be able to do that. And it was really only the aristocracy that could do it, the top cream of the crop. But what do the ordinary people do?
Go to church.
Is that how you spell it? Chartres. Chartres. There's another R there, I think. That's a Chartres. Anyway, so the Basilica in Chartres is where they made the poor man's pilgrimage. It's called the Labyrinth. So in the forecourt of the Chartres Cathedral, there's a labyrinth in the flagstones, and what people, a little bit like the Stations of the Cross, which is also a journey. And what you would do is you would start, and the difference between a labyrinth and a maze is a maze's point is to get you lost. Okay, you constantly get to dead ends in a maze, and you have to find your way to the middle. The labyrinth, there is only one path, and that path takes you in and then takes you back out again. And the concept of the labyrinth is you walk the labyrinth as you pray and contemplate on God till you get to the center of the labyrinth where you've now met with God, and then you move from meeting with God, you move back out into the world. That's the idea of a labyrinth. Okay? And this was the poor man's pilgrimage.
Why a labyrinth though? Is that a small area, or is that
going around it.
No. Small area. So it's only in the forecourt of the cathedral. So I mean, you can get quite big labyrinths, but they're usually still just in a confined space. And the idea with it is that you pray certain prayers, and you contemplate the coming close to God. And then once you've come to the center, you then contemplate what you're going to do out in the world again. So it's a spiritual discipline that was part of the Middle Ages.
There are places nearby here where we used to take the chaplains.
Oh, there's one in Borkham Hills.
Yeah.
So St. Joseph's Spirituality Centre in Borkham Hills has got a labyrinth. It's not a very big one, but it's been laid out, and it's similar to the Chartres one. Yeah.
Even the Stations of the Cross in most Catholic churches.
Yes, well, in fact, almost all Catholic churches will have the 14 stations here. And the idea with that, again, is that you go to each station and then you pray an appropriate prayer at each of the stations of the cross. Again, a sense of journey that you can do for the poor. You know, where the rich ones can go and do it in Jerusalem. Okay, so in Jerusalem, you get the Stations of the Cross there as well. It's called that's it. The Via Dolorosa. Okay? And the Via Dolorosa, it's one major street in the old city of Jerusalem. And so you start from the outside, you actually start from the inside, and then you go towards where the cross is, and then you go back from there back to so you start off at things like the Mount of Olives, and then you walk down from the Mount of Olives into the gate, the Lion's Gate, and then you go up this road, which is called the Via Dolorosa, all the way through to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And each place along the way is one of the stations of the cross. Now, there's only one little problem with that. It's a little problem, is that of course the road that you're on is about 20 meters above the road where potentially it ever happened. Because of course, remember that Jerusalem also is one of those cities where it fell, it was destroyed, and then they built on top of it, and then they built on top of it. So,
It must be very crowded with tourists.
The Via Dolorosa?
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
At Easter it is.
At Easter you basically can't move at all. But the funny thing is that of course most of the Via Dolorosa actually goes through the Muslim section, the Arab section, which I think is quite quite funny, because of course they're trying to sell you something all the way down the whole of the Via Dolorosa, because there's all these little shops right down the Via Dolorosa. So you're kind of going, but I mean there are churches and mosques and stuff all interconnected down this one section.
Similar to Muslim.
Yes, they're Muslim. Yes, absolutely. Oh no, and all the people who are selling you stuff are all Muslims. Yes.
Mecca.
Oh yes, in Mecca, also doing the journey, absolutely. But remember that things like the Hajj is a journey. Okay, so Muslims from all around the world have to go to Mecca. Okay, and when they get to Mecca, what do? They go around the Kaaba. So they go on a journey again. So it's another walking. So you can see that this concept of walking around something is part of religion in general, and they're part of that connection with both Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. Have all got a similar connection in pilgrimage. Okay, so the issue that we have here is that, of course, you've got the Byzantines who have control over the Middle East through until the 7th century, because in 624 the world changes. Okay? Major change happens. A guy called Muhammad. Muhammad. Okay? And at this point, everything changes, and will continue to change our world into the future. Okay? But of course, Muhammad, who grows up within Saudi Arabia, not called Saudi Arabia then, it's just Arabia. And Arabia, of course, is just a collection of loose tribal groups. Okay, remember that there's not a lot of green in Arabia. And so what you do is that it creates an environment of nomadic peoples. Okay, people who move from waterhole to waterhole. Okay, so you're not going to have a country when you have that situation. You're going to have a loose collection of tribal groups. Okay, but there are some places which can sustain population, and so that's where you get cities like Mecca, which is on the coast, which is a trading city, and then Medina, which is further in. And of course, Islam grows out of that, but again, through population growth. Okay, remember, population growth is the big factor. They begin to push out of Arabia and into the Middle East. So they go west into North Africa, and they go north into the Middle East itself, and into what is called the Byzantine Empire. And so the Byzantiums get attacked from the south by the Arabian caliphates. Okay, the Arabian kings who come in and take over. And so then, instead of being now Christian, it becomes Muslim. But you need to realize that for the first number of years, in fact, for the first few hundred years, the Arabs generally are okay with the Christians. Okay, they are prepared to allow the Christians to still come and do their pilgrimages into Israel. Now, why? Business. Isn't that wonderful? Remember what I told you about trade? Okay, trade is the lifeblood of civilization, and tourism is just another form of trade. Okay, and so that's of course what happens. But of course they rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. They rebuild. They even put a special shrine on top of the Temple Mount, which is the Dome of the Rock. All of those things get done during that period. But they essentially take over a lot of the Middle Eastern part that was Byzantium, actually now becomes Arabian. Okay, and the Arabian Empire develops out of that. Okay, now of course on the other side in Europe, they decide that they want to take it back, and so well, just before that, in 1056, we've got the split between the church now in the east and the church in the west. And that split is the split between the Roman Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church. Okay? And the Orthodox Church, rather than the Greek Orthodox, because it's not just Greek, it's all the different nationalities in terms of Orthodox. But we've got the split. But now what happens because of that is that the Roman Church loses its
number one position.
Well, not just that, it loses its tourism industry.
Oh, wow.
Okay, because now, of course, remember that the East is under the eastern side of the church. And so the West doesn't have its tourism industry. And I think that's one of the reasons why we end up with this thing in 1096 called the Crusades. Okay, 1096, the Crusades get called by a pope called Pope Urban II. And of course, the whole point of the Crusades is to go and take back the Holy Land. Now, I don't think they're just taking it back for Christianity. They're taking it back for the Western Roman Church. Okay, because of course now the Western Roman Church then will take over those sites, which is in fact exactly what they do. Okay, and for the next 100 years, the Crusades control that part of the world. But as they come past the Byzantines, they begin to cause some friction. Because you can imagine, if you've got your empire and all of a sudden you've got all these soldiers coming across from the western side, coming through, you can imagine that you get a little bit uneasy about this. Okay, because it's quite easy for them to turn on. Well, guess what? That's exactly what happens. Well, they built a wall. Oh, yes, they did have walls. But that's exactly what happens. And in fact, it's the Crusaders that actually weaken Constantinople, because they attack Constantinople themselves. And in fact, in subsequent Crusades, they actually are actively paid to go and attack Byzantium. And they're paid by other merchants in other parts of the Mediterranean so that they would get control of the trade that was going through Byzantium. And all of this weakens the Byzantine Empire until the next big empire begins to develop. The one that overwhelms the Arab caliphates is in fact the Turkish Caliphate. And as that Turkish Caliphate, which begins by the process of kicking out the Crusaders, later on becomes the ancestor to what is one of the biggest empires of the modern period, and that's the empire called the Ottomans. The Ottoman Empire. And it's the Ottoman Empire that then besieges Constantinople.
So what year was that?
1453. And it's in 1453 that the Ottomans are able to sack Constantinople and absorb it into the Ottoman Empire. And that's the end of the Roman Empire. Now, just a little bit of tidbit of information as well, just interesting. Who was the last emperor of the Western Roman Empire?
Charlemagne.
And I know you're thinking a bit later now, but the Roman Empire, the Western Roman Empire, who was destroyed in 476, who was the emperor at the time? It's actually quite easy to remember, because who was the first king of Rome? Romulus. Well, the last one was called Romulus. He was Romulus Augustus. I think that I love that. It's kind of a bit of an irony in there, isn't it? Is that the first one's called Romulus, and the last one of the Roman Empire in the West is Romulus. Okay, but essentially that's the history of Rome for 2,000 years. Now, how was that possible? How did we end up with an empire that lasted so long? Well, I've talked about cultural absorption, right? That was one of the big ones. But let me tell you the other one, which I think is very important, and the one that also held together the Roman Empire. And that's the concept of the Roman Empire was an extremely violent empire and used force or the threat of force to keep its empire together. I mean, when you think about the Roman Empire, it was at war for basically its entire existence. For 2,000 years, it was basically fighting someone, either internally or externally. Okay? And it was the issue of violence and the way in which they utilized violence as a means of control. And this is one thing that I've been saying about where Christianity went wrong, was because it grew within an environment of Judaism, right? Where Jesus said things like, love your, not your neighbor, well, you said that too, but love your enemies. Do good to those who hurt you. If someone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other. That was the words of Jesus. It was an environment of coming against violence. I mean, essentially, if you look at the Christian message, if you boil it down to one 4-letter word, it is
Love.
well, peace is 5, but yes, it's it's love. It's love. Love is the core of Jesus' message. For God so loved the world. It was about love, was the core of the Christian message. And the thing that is that if we don't get hold of that, we don't actually get hold of Christianity. But when you get to Constantine makes the playing field flat, and Theodosius makes it the religion of Rome. But if you're going to become the religion of Rome, and remember what I've told you about Rome, that Rome was a cultural absorber. Well, Theodosius realized by the time we get to the late 4th century that Christianity was a force to be reckoned with. And you either have to appropriate it or it's going to change you. So what did they do? They absorbed it into Rome. But when it did that, it allowed the violence now to actually become part of Christianity. And I believe at that point, Christianity was fundamentally changed. We began to change the way in which we promoted Christianity. We changed the way in which we connected with what Christianity was. We changed the theological framework. I mean, people like Augustine had to all of a sudden begin to develop a concept for war. There is nothing in the Bible that tells us that we should go to war. Certainly not in the New Testament. But all of a sudden, the theologians had to come up with that. And so they had to come up with a theory called the just war theory in order to justify being part of an organization and a group who was inherently violent. And so violence becomes, as it was in the Roman Empire, a means to an end. So in Christianity, violence becomes a means to an end. When in fact, Jesus had said the very means to the end was not violence, but love. Now, I find that quite phenomenal when you get hold of that. Because what it tells you is that Christianity became something it was not intended to be. And for me, the thing that makes me excited about living in this day and age is that we've now come to a place in the West where we're wanting to go back to what Jesus said. And return not to our Roman roots, but return instead to our Jewish roots.